slide deck is also in the chat. Okay, I'm going to click admit.
Yep.
Hello, everybody. How's it? I see a nice heart. Thank you for everyone, whoever put the heart in. I'm gonna unenable the waiting room. We're gonna keep chat open here and in Kernel General. So in Kernel General, if you have any links or things that you think that the crew should see for later, you'll put it in there. Please mute if you have any background noise. I'll mute some people. And yeah, we're excited to kick off. I hope everyone's having a wonderful week 2. Just to set the stage a bit, we don't really need to do this for Rebecca and Annalise because they were in Kernel Block 2 and they kind of know a bit about how the blocks go, but we're equally excited about Block 3 as we were to have you two and many other awesome people in Block 2. This group, I think slightly more artists, creatives, builders from NFT world in Kernel Block 2 than there were in Block 3. But in general, another incredible group of people from all types of educational backgrounds, all types of companies, and working on all types of interesting new things in Web3. The last block, we had the grandfather of NFTs, Matt Condon, who worked on the 721 standard. This block, we have the philosopher of NFTs, of whom which is still someone that people haven't figured out quite yet who is. If you find him, there might be an NFT in it for you, but who's counting? But yeah, we're in week 2, which means that we've kind of had 2 weeks to get to know each other, to explore in many different conversational spaces, of course through Kickoff, of course through the Kernel Interest channel, but this block through many more juntos successfully accomplished in previous blocks, which means that there's been many small group conversations flying around about the content, about different ideas in Web3, and it's been really, really refreshing to see. So if you've led a junto, thank you so much. It's a real treat to be a part of some of those conversations and to see the wide-ranging conversations that are being held from the weekly yoga class, which is technically in the junto flow, to conversations about trust spaces, to conversations about NFTs and smart contract security. You kind of have it all. And the focus this week is settling in. So many introductions have started to be made to mentors. If you haven't gotten any mentor introductions yet, be on the lookout because those are coming. And hopefully you have a sense of what's possible now with the 6 weeks left in the program and the ways that you, based on what you are interested in doing within your Web3 context, the opportunity to leverage the kernel community in any way that you so choose. And the hope is that, yeah, you kind of find some space to slow down. We'll have 2 or 3 weeks here where the general focus is building towards whatever that is for you. It could be building a prototype, it could be writing a blog post, it could be working on your PhD thesis, which is what Annalise did last block. And all of these things are incredible and things that we want you to choose, to feel like you have the space and time to do so. And then we have an Expo Week, which is Kernel Expo Week, which starts June 21st, which is not next Monday or the Monday after, but what is that, 3 Mondays from now? So we have a bit of time, but that's where we bring in at least 50 mentors. And ideally, there's some one-on-one time, kind of science fair style, to share your project with 2 or 3 different mentors over the course of an hour or an hour and a half. So a sense here that we're moving towards kind of an internal direction, some time with yourself to describe what it is that you want to do with the next 6 weeks, now that you've gotten the chance to get to know many of the people in the program. Of course, that will continue as well. With that, I'm going to pass to Andy to structure where we are within the syllabus a bit before doing some introductions of our guests for this week.
Thanks a lot. I'm disappointed that you're not wearing your suit, but we'll deal with it and move on very, very quickly, so that we can get to the real meat of this discussion, which is our two incredible guests from Block 2. Very, very simply, we spent module 0 and 1 setting the foundation, both in terms of the way in which we will think about the content that is presented in kernel, but also just ways of navigating the wider world of Web3 and, in fact, the World Wide Web in general. In particular, this has to do with noting always the play of pattern and a certain kind of humility required to see that anything that you encounter in the world of space and time, in particular human relationships, is always one of two poles, and being able to hold in mind both complementary opposites, see the entire spectrum of probability between, and choose with clarity and reflection the correct trade-off in your own particular context is a theme that will come up again and again and again. The best ways in which to illustrate this and what lies at the foundation of this blockchain of knowledge that we will build up together in our peer-to-peer way over the next 6 weeks is trust, value, and meaning. These have all sort of been covered in many incredible yuntos, and it's something that I'd like to echo of Vivek's, that it's wonderful to see how many yuntos have been taking place, how many incredible conversations that have nothing to do with the kernel organization that have just cropped up organically as a result of the incredible people in this block. So truly, so many of the people here are co-creating their own experience in kernel, and that's really what this week, but the entire experience in kernel has always been intended for, which is this destruction of audiences and the reinstantiation of creative participation. In order to understand what creative participation is really all about, we need to know how to ask better questions. So that's where we start with in module 2, which is about the global financial system. But before we dive into balance sheets and T accounts and Keynesian versus monetarist economics and where money comes from, whether it was collectibles or debt, and what the anthropology and history is around value, the critical aspect of this week's syllabus is how do we actually ask good questions? And if you go to that piece, you'll see that it really begins with clarity and honesty about what you don't know. We come back to these two things all the time, because if you're clear and honest about how much you don't know, which is a huge amount for all of us, then practice that in relationship with other people. It breeds a whole new kind of humility, which is necessary for seeing deeper into the play of pattern between complementary opposites. And in fact, many traditions the world over have developed around this particular point of practicing humility in relation to what you don't know with other people. So for instance, in the Western tradition, Socratic circles and Socratic dialogue is perhaps the most contextually relevant to what we're talking about today, because these were dialogic spaces that were based upon the interaction of peers and that emphasized the level of questioning and thinking where there's no single right answer. And that's where we're at the moment. There's no single right answer. We're not presenting any answers. All we're here to try and do is draw out the most interesting questions that we can ask in the context of our relationships with one another that might lead us into deeper and richer explorations of our shared truths. So because any sort of complex situation never has any single right answer, we end up in these constant interpretive balancing acts. And one of the most critical of these interpretive balancing acts is that between money and speech. So that's what the other piece is, the Web3 aspects of module 2. And the essential point that is in that piece, apart from what's highlighted on the slides here, is that this new order of econolinguistic network means that everyone is simultaneously free to speak, and that the cost of any meaningful speech is well defined everywhere. So speech and execution are one and the same thing, and interpretation is deterministic. So we move from this interpretive balancing act between so-called true and false statements, which are always open to people's own ambiguous and subjective interpretation, towards balancing meaning and cost. And that is a fundamental change in the regulation of valuable expression, which is deeply interesting to think about. The one from sort of my opinion of what is true and false towards an easier to quantify investigation of meaning and cost. And that means that the most effective way to free meaning is to price it correctly. So pricing different kinds of speech appropriately rather than trying to protect this culturally conditioned ideal of free speech also has the second order effect of better securing public goods, which is something that we can think about. But I also highly recommend that you all read Matt Stevenson's article, which he released today, about the difference between coordination games and public goods games. It's a really fantastic article. It comes, directly after speaking about various different aspects of game theory with Nikki Case in the module on trust, and has some of the clearest insights into these 2x2 game theoretic matrices that you'll often see that describe different kinds of games and the incentives and the stable equilibria, and how we can try and think about shifting more and more of these games away from public goods problems into coordination problems, which have different stable equilibria, and which really sort of leverage this power of, for instance, Ethereum as a literally game-changing technology, like we talked about with Kev last week. The last thing I will say about this is that sort of when we stop protecting free speech, but instead price any speech according to a set of explicit consensus rules that we all agree to follow, the space of meaningful communications is in fact greatly expanded, because it incentivizes creative participation, which is very similar to what Sarah Zucker was saying in the culture chat yesterday, that, it's really about people showing up and being self-reliant and saying, hey, like nobody knows what's going on here, but I can try my hand at it. I thought that what she had to say about a thoughtful, careful approach to what you do that is deeply intentional and that starts simple is worth repeating again and again and again and again. Start simple, be intentional, have a careful approach, but balance that always with just doing something, with the ability to, change state that we all have in a permissionless manner. We then sort of, the curated materials follow a particular line of thought into the history and anthropology of money. We begin with Nick Szabo looking at the common story of money sort of begins with barter and the coincidence of wants problem, and how that leads to increasingly better abstractions of money that move away from sort of commodities having begun in the world of collectibles and into like better and better abstractions, finally into like gold and silver and then paper-based money. But then we flip that narrative with a really wonderful talk given at Google based on a book written by David Graeber on debt, and thinking that in fact, this particular economics 101 narrative about barter, money, credit is in fact not just wrong, it's exactly the opposite way around. If you actually look at the anthropology of the development of money, it begins with complex social credit networks. Only when those break down do you get the implementation of currency, which is often associated with military expansion, the need to fund armies, and concomitantly the need to collect taxes. That leads us into an actual deep dive into how the modern financial system works with Perry Mehrling at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And he does a really, really wonderful job of talking about all sorts of instruments like sort of residential mortgage-backed securities and interest rate swaps and CDSs and all of the things that led to 2008, and how the shadow banking system actually works, what FedWire is, how to read the Federal Reserve balance sheets, what QE 1, 2, and 3 were, although this course was given before QE Infinity, and all of the things that are actually necessary to understand before we can really meaningfully talk about what it might mean to reinvent or change some aspects of the financial system. And that leads us finally into Andreas Antonoupoulous, engineering money, and the notion that once we can engineer the fundamental properties of money, we can actually reset certain critical society level conversations. And that should be sort of where we get to today with Rebecca and Annalise.
Amazing. Amazing. Yeah, QE and Infinity sounds quite interesting. I'm excited for us to explore. But more importantly, I'm very, very grateful to both Annalise and Rebecca, first of all, for spending time with us. A huge impact on what was possible in the program, and are both incredible. And so I said this to them and I meant it, that I don't think there's a better two people to have this particular conversation, which is about money, what it means from both a practical sense, what's going on in DeFi, how does it relate to where we might want to go, and from kind of like a people-oriented context. In an anthropological sense, Graeber is very much an impactful figure in this kernel syllabus, and he passed this past year right before Kernel Block 2 actually kicked off. And so it was a really meaningful time to get to know Annalise, to get deeper into some of Graeber's work, and I'm excited for both of those things to happen. So I'll give a brief. She previously worked at CoinDesk and is now working on her PhD in anthropology at the London School of Economics, where she studied with Graeber before his passing. She hosts the Crypto Salon, which is an awesome space to explore interesting ideas in crypto, some of which occurred during the last Kernel Block, and I believe some more that are to continue soon. So when Annalise presents in a bit, I hope we can talk a bit about that. And then we have Rebecca Mqamelo, still working on the pronunciation, but she's incredible, working as the head of growth at Zerion, which is one of the leading DeFi exchanges. Is not the right word for it. Wallets, perhaps, maybe something closer, but not either. Something in between. Does research at grassroots economics, which will come up in her slides, which is a really interesting project at the edges of what's possible with DeFi. Went to Minerva School, which is one of the coolest schools that I've ever seen. Is an incredible writer. If you're ever keen on getting down into some rabbit holes, her blog is a great place to do so. So yeah, we'll start with Rebecca. We're gonna do 5 minutes in DeFi, one of the hardest tasks of the day, and then we'll move to Annalise and explore the broader conversation around money.
Thank you, Vivek. It's Mqamelo, by the way, but definitely getting better. All right, so I'm going to do my best to give a 5-minute overview of decentralized finance. And I also want to acknowledge that not everyone here is familiar with DeFi, perhaps hasn't even used tools like Zerion and Szabo, all the others that exist. So I guess the best place to begin is maybe just with a very brief definition of what we're talking about when we say things like decentralized finance or DeFi. And I think the simple way that I could explain it is that it's finance reimagined in permissionless, programmable, and composable form. And I have a little picture of Lego blocks because DeFi is often described as Lego money. So, it's programmable in the sense that your money is controlled by smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain or others, not necessarily people. You're looking at money as pieces of code. And you have a universal settlement layer that doesn't have all the middlemen. So instead of the banks and all the other institutions, you have the Ethereum blockchain. And then, of course, it's permissionless in the sense that there are no gatekeepers restricting either who can access decentralized finance or who can build within it. So, when you use platforms like Zerion, for example, you're not going to go through KYC, passport checks, or anything like that. And then finally, composable, which is probably the most exciting. You could also use the word interoperable here, just in the sense that different applications can be built on top of each other. And you see this both at the protocol layer, you see this at the token layer in terms of the kinds of products that are available. So yield farming, for example, would be a perfect example here of stacking different investment opportunities. And hence going back to the analogy of just playing with a box of Legos. But I guess it's also more interesting to ask, well, why does DeFi exist? And I think that this is just primarily because the infrastructure of most traditional financial applications and services has a built-in bias towards exclusivity, extraction, and I would also argue exploitation. And I think we see this again and again in the kind of geographical lotteries that exist. So the fact that even the most innovative fintech companies haven't really been able to solve the issue of just global access. And there are tons of examples there, but I think knowing that DeFi stems very much also from an ideological response to the problems that we have in our economic system is something that's always good to keep in mind, and I think has definitely come through in the kind of readings that we have here at Kernel. So I guess just to give a very brief overview of the DeFi space, Vivek, you can move on to the next slide. Thanks. DeFi is many things. And I found this very useful map. I think it was by Lex from Consensus. If you just look at the difference between what's on the left versus what's on the right, there is a DeFi use case for every kind of financial service or product that we use, right? So whether we're talking about base cash money, you could look at things like stable coins. There's the wallet layer, right? So the idea of platforms like Zerion or Argent and others aggregating all of these and putting it into a user interface that people could use. And then, of course, is exciting also at the protocol layer, the kinds of things that have been built, the different kinds of monetary designs that exist, the different kinds of governance that exists behind all of these tokens and protocols. So I guess whether you're familiar with these or not, and Vic, you can move on to the next one. I think the most important thing to remember is that DeFi is disrupting the supply and distribution of money. And because money is the universal quantifiable metric that we have for mediating incentives, this in turn means that DeFi is disrupting a lot more than just finance. Of course, most obviously, there are the financial markets, but there's also things like disrupting organizational structures, right? So what happens when you have tokenized governance or DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations? DeFi is also disrupting things like funding models. And I look at Gitcoin as a really wonderful example of this. The creator economy, or perhaps even just expression of creativity. And I think we saw this with the sort of rise of social money and NFTs that we've seen throughout this year. And the list could go on and on. And to the next slide here, I think the thing that I always go back to is we really need to get comfortable with the new meanings of money in a world of competing currencies. And I was reading the chat earlier, and I think it was William who mentioned Hayek. And this does speak to the kind of work that Hayek did back in 1976, when he wrote in the Denationalization of Money that the future would just consist of a world of competing currencies. And I know, at least for myself, the kinds of conversations that I have with people when talking about DeFi, for someone that isn't familiar with the space, the first thing is just wrapping your head around the fact that, yes, we can live in a world where there are hundreds of thousands of currencies. Some are meme coins, some are governance tokens, some are stable coins meant to potentially replace the way that we use national currency. The idea, though, is that each of these tokens is playing very different functions. And so I think that for those of us that work within this space, I would also argue that perhaps just one of the biggest branding or communication challenges is grappling with this idea of having money fulfill multiple roles, and that be okay as well. And I think given just the kind of tokens and projects that we work with, that's something that you realize pretty quickly working in this space. And I also think what's really important about it is that because money can fulfill these different roles, and we might be living in a world of competing currencies, ideally the ones that survive are the ones that serve our best interests. And I think the questions that we ask are so important for this reason so early on, because we have to ask what kind of system do we want to scale? What does it bias for? What are the values that we have that we bake into the way that we use money, the way that we manage monetary protocols of the future? But I also want to acknowledge that DeFi, as much as it has principles and aims, also looks a very specific way right now. And I brought this up in the last time I did this presentation in Block 2, but it's worth saying until the problem doesn't exist, which is that DeFi has a weird Henry problem. Weird in the sense of the majority of people using DeFi right now come from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies, and we might describe as belonging to the bracket of high earners, not yet rich. So hence the weird Henry abbreviation there. I think if you look at just the statistics on who's using DeFi, right, so looking at simple metrics like Google Analytics, which of course is not an accurate, it's not perfectly accurate, but is a pretty good proxy. I could speak to the company that I work with, where less than 10% of our users are women, for example. And I think that a lot of the conversation that happens around what is in DeFi and what's happening in DeFi is also very often focused on the retail investment use case. But I want to highlight that there are projects using these exact same tools in very, very different ways. And one of them that I've been working with for the last 2-3 years is Grassroots Economics. Some of you might be familiar with their work in Kenya, where they're building community currency systems, essentially going into communities, often low income, both in rural and urban slum areas, and saying, well, what would happen if you created your own form of money and held that as a complement to the national currency that you use on a day-to-day basis? And the kinds of groups that they're going to are, women's groups, village elders, farmers co-ops, and essentially onboarding them onto using DeFi tools, using USSD codes. Doesn't necessarily require internet. And so you have over 40,000 people around Kenya trading on a daily basis. They're using the X-DAI blockchain at the moment. And they've seen over 2.5 million in traded volume. And given the work that I've done with them over the last 3 years, we recently did a randomized control trial on community currencies being used sort of as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the one biggest takeaway that I've learned, and kind of contrasting this to the work that we usually do and how we usually work within DeFi, is just the sort of boots on the ground work that is also required. Right now, I think DeFi often exists in spaces where we do have access to things like great tools, technology that enables us to build amazing projects. But I would push us to also ask the question of, well, what does DeFi look like in the contexts that we least expect it? And what would it take to make that possible? So in conclusion to all of this, there are many things in DeFi that attract people. For some, it is the financial opportunity, and I totally understand why that's the biggest one. But I also want to say that if the best that we can do with all of this is give people access to 50%, 100% APY, then that would be quite disappointing and quite boring as well. There's so much that is possible with this, and I think we are seeing that being pushed around things like organizational structure, governance, new forms of money, new development tools. And what's really needed there is just the research and the education around those things. So on that note, I will pause, and I'm very, very excited to hear from Annalise, because I also know that a lot of her work has touched on this.
Amazing, amazing. Such great ground to start a wonderful conversation. I think thinking about that world that Hayek mentions, the hundreds of thousands of types of money and the different ways that they might be used, it's something that we can reason about, we can think about, and perhaps start to be one step ahead. And so I'm hopeful that this conversation helps. We've talked about Annalise's background, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. We do have the first couple of slides around Graeber and what Graeber was, who he was, and perhaps if Annalise is willing to start there, or with any comments on how Rebecca kicked us off, we can use that to get into a wider conversation around money.
Yeah, Rebecca, thanks so much for that. I'm so interested in your research and to hear. I'd love to read your dissertation and everything about grassroots economics. If you have a chance to send it on, I'd love to. So I am a third-year PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at the London School of Economics. David was my supervisor until he passed away in September. He was one of two of my supervisors, the other of which is Laura Baer, who's also wonderful. And David supervised my master's degree at LSE, also in anthropology, from 2016 to 2017. And he was just a completely wonderful person and a completely brilliant scholar. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from Ded and a lot that we can learn from his work, particularly if you're building in crypto, if you're trying to design a token, if you're trying to design a new system and things like that. There's a lot to consider in those books. And I think kind of the big thing that Ded really shows us is that money is ultimately kind of fundamentally about social relationships. You know, I think one of the sort of, if you watch the video that was posted in the readings, you know, one of the things that he says is sort of, you know, nice people use credit. And he talks about kind of coinage emerging later when, you know, you sort of kind of develop militaries and you sort of are in kind of more violent periods in history and things like that. But ultimately kind of what binds communities together is sort of this shared debt that they owe each other things. And this is kind of, you get this sort of, you know, web of social relationships that way. And this is very important. And so in this way, you know, money is also kind of tied up with morality. This is an important observation as well. And David wasn't really that keen on crypto. He told me once, he just said, basically people are constantly asking me like, what do you think about Bitcoin? What do you think about Bitcoin? And this really annoyed him. And he sort of said, for that reason, I've just intentionally not looked into it. But, he said, maybe you can kind of talk to me about it a bit and we'll kind of learn as your thesis develops. But one of the things that he used to say to me, and it was also echoed in this video, is also kind of that, we've had virtual money for a long time. People keep saying that, oh, you've got these cryptocurrencies and things like that. Virtual money, it's very new, it's very exciting. But he said, we have these credit systems, which are effectively virtual money, and we've had them for centuries. Why is this so exciting? Why should people be interested in crypto? And he also told me that, kind of going back to this point where, sort of credit is for people who kind of like each other and are nice to each other. He said, Bitcoin is kind of the very opposite of debt, because you're basically, it's pseudonymous. It's the sort of thing that it's like gold and silver, where you use it when you don't really want to have much to do with the other person, when you're in a very low trust environment, when there's no trust at all. So this is kind of interesting. The other thing that we talked about on a few occasions was kind of the idea that sort of people in crypto are building these kind of moral communities. And I wish that I was able to talk to him about that a bit more, because we never really got to develop that idea further. But I do think that there is this very, sort of, I don't know how you'd put it, but I mean, I think that people in the community are really trying to build things with a real moral quality to them, and say this, this money that we're creating is not, it's not just money. It's going to kind of solve inflation. It's going to make people, more equal. It's not undermining people's life savings. It's creating a better future for us. It's all of this very, highly, sort of moralistic kind of discourse. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
The other thing we kind of talked about at times was the fact that in crypto, the sort of discourse that creates value, that makes these cryptocurrencies value, is actually about value. It's all of these conversations about why things are kind of worth what they are that makes cryptocurrencies valuable. And something that he also explored in his work, which I always thought was really incredible, was, he was very interested in play. And I think he was a very playful person. And I think this is something that we should really pay attention to. And he wrote an article in the Baffler a couple years ago. And basically his kind of whole point was, what if actually we've been missing kind of the big story here for what makes, what drives kind of beings everywhere? What if we're all sort of driven by play? Basically we find evidence of play in pretty much every animals, even the ones that scientists basically call robots, like lobsters and things like that. And so he said kind of, the point of the story is basically like, well, what if these economists and these other people sort of have it fundamentally wrong? And what if our kind of, whole society isn't structured based on kind of incentives and, self-interest and all of this stuff? And what if it's really just at its core about play? And I think this is a really interesting thought. And it's also an interesting thought if you're trying to think about how we might build a new society and this sort of stuff. And I think it's also especially relevant to crypto, because I think for economists, especially, some of, what happens in crypto is completely inexplicable. You look at people, sort of trading Dogecoin and investing in Dogecoin, and it seems completely senseless. And you look at all of the memes that are circulating, and it all seems kind of senseless from this sort of cold, calculating, rational perspective. But under sort of his version of things, this makes a lot of sense, actually. And if you look at trading meme stocks and things like this also makes a lot of sense. It's not just that people are, bored necessarily, which is what, Matt Levine has said, for example, and this is why this is happening. It's because I think there is a real playfulness that is coming out here.
It's hilarious. William is showing AMC in the chat. We need to hold off before we get too out of hand here. But no, it's so important that blog post on play. If anyone hasn't read it, we'll put it in the chat. It gave me such a lens into Graeber and who he was. And he wrote that article hoping that the people who read it had fun along the way, and hoping that it was showing with its feeling what it intended to describe. And that's something that genuinely comes to mind a lot as we think about how kernel is instantiated. I wonder if Andy, just to continue on like some of these thoughts about moral communities that from Annalise, Matt Stevenson says moral communities is dead on and underrated. It's a great point. And Andy referenced a really early Graeber paper, I believe, that is kind of underrepresented in most crypto community conversations. Everyone kind of talks about debt, but doesn't talk as much about David's anarchist background and some of maybe his more seminal works in anthropology. And Andy specifically called out a couple of these quotes, which of course are hard to read on the slides, but hopefully we can talk through. Talks about faith. It talks about the belief that we can build a more livable society, of which money is, of course, a very important primitive, that we otherwise couldn't. And maybe Andy, if you have anything else there that you'd like to expand upon.
Before we, question Annalise on her take of morality and value and all of these fascinating things that she's opened for us, I think that it's a good place to start is with what Rebecca said about meaning. In particular, getting comfortable with money meaning various different things. It's a point that Andreas makes in the final video, that we're really terrible at understanding this term money because it's not actually the definition of anything. It's a general classifier, and we're much better off speaking about its specific and technical characteristics. But one of the things that I'm most interested in, and perhaps Rebecca can speak to this and bridge it into a conversation about wider moralistic implications and what they have to do with community, is that the word currency comes from the Latin for to flow, right? That's literally what currency means. It means the flow of value in a society. And the question is, what are the ways in which we can get it to flow uninhibited by the sort of vicissitudes of those in power? What are the ways in which we can generate an uninterrupted flow of value to the people who most need it in society? And what are the ways in which we can flow while building it? I'm really interested in this notion of currency flow and the redevelopment of new and different kinds of meaning, because Annalise has said that we've had virtual currencies since Charlemagne and before. What's interesting now is not virtual currencies, but programmable currency, programmable flow. And I wonder if Rebecca perhaps wants to pick up on that, some of the flows that happened or didn't happen with the grassroots economic experiments in that randomized control trial, and how she thinks about the morality of that kind of work as opposed to the normal DeFi weird Henry bubble.
Yeah, I would have to say I don't think of it in moral terms. There are definitely contrasts, and I think, as I mentioned, I'm very, very grateful to have had these experiences of working with sort of the for-profit or maybe more retail investment focused side of DeFi and crypto in general, and then also the non-profit side where you have like tons of organizations around the world doing similar projects. Grassroots economics certainly isn't the only one. I would say that in my research, I think the biggest takeaway that I've had is kind of sometimes the tension and the harmony that exists between sort of the protocol design side of these new monetary tools and the community and the work that goes into onboarding people and building trust. And I think that any successful token and DeFi project really has to try and marry the two. And it's a constant challenge. So to give an example, at the design level, a community currency is not something that you want people to hoard, right? It exists to stimulate local trade. And so ideally, you want this money flowing and exchanging hands many times. And so one of the things that grassroots economics has done in the past, although they no longer do, is having something like negative tax on holdings, right? So if I have a wallet of, let's say, $200 and that money hasn't moved in a month, I could be taxed a small percentage of that, and that would go towards network fees or just the general community treasury that you have. So there are all these design parameters, and you see these cropping up in different ways, in the ways that tokens are designed, in ways that protocols govern themselves. And then there's also the side of community and I say on the ground, because at least in this sense, it literally is, right? You physically go into these communities. You don't just airdrop tokens to people. You have to get the consensus of the village elders and the women's groups and the local farmers and all the businesses that you want to be using this thing. And I think that's a challenge that we don't find ourselves facing, or at least we don't find ourselves facing in such a tangible way for most of us who work within DeFi, because the communication layer often happens in an anonymized way, right? It happens on Discord, it happens on crypto Twitter. It also happens in spaces like this, like Kernel, which is really nice because we get to see each other and we get to see people. And so I think the big challenge for DeFi, at least the next stage within DeFi's growth, is onboarding the non-crypto natives. And whether, again, I wouldn't use moral terms, but I do think that it challenges us to think about how we present DeFi. It challenges us to think about the language and the inclusivity of the spaces in which we work. I know that in my own work, just things as simple as jargon become serious problems, right? So people associate DeFi with yield farming and staking, and what do these things actually mean? What are they actually achieving? It's very easy to get into that financial retail investment sort of rabbit hole, and I think it's very easy to get trapped there for so many reasons. So I don't know if that really answers your question. Yeah, that's the way that I think about it.
Sure, I think that that's interesting, and there are a lot of people in the chat who would be interested, A, to read your paper, and B, to hear a little bit more which is in that paper, about the actual statistics of who used what and where a value flowed in this randomized control trial, and how the community currency framework has worked so far in grassroots economics. But I do want to challenge what you say, because I understand deeply the desire to stay away from moralistic language. And yet, to me, in some very real sense, it seems like the way in which to actually combat jargon, to actually overcome some of the educational, linguistic, technical, and other kinds of barriers, particularly cultural ones, is precisely to be a little bit moralistic. It's an unpopular opinion in crypto, but it's one of the great things that I respect about Graeber and the anthropological approach in general. Speaking to this paper that Vivek has mentioned, Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, he's just really real about the fact that everything is moral, everything is moralistic in some sense. And I think that the framework that Annalise has presented is particularly interesting in this regard, because in my question to you, Annalise, based on what Rebecca has said as well, is how seriously can we take play? The notion of play is not something that is inconsequential just because it's lighthearted. There is a very deep difference between those two things. And when we play with morality, when we play with language, when we play with financial tools, we can have these really important society level conversations about the kind of morals that we want to code into our system. If we're going to program the flow of value through society, it's a fundamentally moral action. And yes, nobody likes to speak about these things because we don't like to say that we're ever going to impose our morality on other people. And we know the historical precedents for saying I'm right and you're wrong, and we're going to do things my way. And I buy all of that completely, but that doesn't mean that we can necessarily shy away from morality in total and just say, look, this is not, we're going to build completely neutral protocols. Again, there's this great drive within the crypto world for credible neutrality. That's an admirable thing at a technical level because you can specify it and quantify it. But in terms of the sort of trust that we're building, in terms of these boots on the ground that we need to actually have in places where these technologies can make the kind of impact which we hope to, based on our own moral underpinnings, we need to have these conversations, and we need to have the kinds of spaces where we can play with different kinds of morality, different kinds of moral thoughts, and in general, different kinds of approach to the moral implications of finance, because this is something that the current financial system has rejected, right? Like if you look at the stock market, if you look at things like AMC and GameStop and all the stuff that William is burning up in the chat, you know, these things are, it's a game, right? But because we've forgotten that it's a game, because we don't take play seriously, you know, all of a sudden the kind of moral dimension of play, which is fundamentally about trust, vulnerability, putting yourself in positions with other people that you ordinarily wouldn't, is forgotten. So Annalise, how have you thought about, yeah, the moral implications of crypto? What kind of conversation would you have had with David were he still around? How has that evolved in the year or so since his passing?
Yeah, I guess I would want to talk to him a bit about kind of, you know, the rules of play in crypto, because I think this is something that we should all be kind of attuned to, is that it's not just sort of this kind of free form, everybody's just sort of doing what they want, kind of, you know, just whatever. But that there are rules to the way that people play, and there are rules to kind of, you know, making memes and how to make them successful and this sort of stuff. And I think that I guess this is sort of my kind of grand theory, is that a lot of the play that's being done in crypto is also kind of a gatekeeping thing. And it's sort of like, if you know how to play the game, you can be one of us. If you don't know how to play the game, you can't be one of us. And a lot of the jargon that's developed around DeFi particularly, you know, you talk about, I don't know, you look at all the memes and you see the, you know, Chad trader versus Virgin DeFi trader, you know, at the aping into things and all of this stuff. And people, I think, from the outside look in on this and think, what is, you know, what does this even mean? What is going on? We have no idea what this means. And I really think that's intentional. And I think it's intended to keep, you know, a particular set of people out, and whether that's just kind of like the normies, but more specifically, I think it's kind of trying to keep the people out who sort of, you know, created and architected the kind of traditional financial system and made that inaccessible to kind of the generation of people who are into crypto and that sort of thing. And I think it's in some way their revenge is this play and saying, we're having fun here, you know, and to some extent you have to ask, well, where does that turn into just nihilism? You know, it's a good question. But I think a lot of it has to do with keeping other people out and playing a game that they don't know the rules to, and keeping it that way to some extent. And I guess so the kind of to answer your question more directly, the sort of moral stuff that's happening, I think, is interesting if you kind of look at it kind of in the context of, you know, what are people trying to move away from with regard to the traditional financial system? What are they trying to set up that's new and different to that? And how are they reacting to the traditional financial system? That sort of stuff. And what are they saying? What kind of claims are they making? You know, I think a lot of it has to do with people reacting to the financial crisis and kind of wanting to stake out sort of a new type of, you know, new economic mode of being and things like that. That doesn't include the people who sort of wrecked the economy, and that includes new, you know, assets and new things, and especially ownership is kind of what's being emphasized there, which I think we had planned to talk about a little bit as well.
Yeah, definitely. I see Rebecca might have something to add.
Yeah. I think another thing that I wanted to add, and first of all, I appreciate Andy pushing back on our hesitancy to talk about, you know, is this just a moral issue? And you know, maybe the most obvious one to think about is what we've been touching on now, which is around, you know, who has access to these things, who is building it, how inclusive is DeFi really? And I mean, my personal answer, at least, is that not very much, at least from what I've seen. But another thing that I think it's maybe a broader question is also just how we tie in DeFi to the physical reality around us and the physical world around us. And, you know, one of the biggest challenges right now is climate change and just the natural resources that we have and how we allocate them. And I actually came across a tweet, which I really loved. I'm going to read it, where this person who, you know, has been in DeFi for a while said, I think the biggest lesson that crypto is teaching people is that everything in the entire world is just made up. Once you come to terms with that, it all makes sense. And I think that this is something that many people in DeFi can resonate with, or crypto in general, right? It's narrative, it's play. It's, if you just look at the sheer number of tokens and forms of money that get created on a daily basis, I often laugh with my colleagues of like, yeah, I do just work in an industry of magic internet money and money Legos, and none of it does make sense, and it's fun. And I also think that there is a point where we have to reconcile this attitude of abundance with the physical limits of our natural world. And I think we've seen this in terms of the pushback that has come around, say, just the energy used up by Bitcoin mining, or like the gas costs on the Ethereum network on layer 1. And so all of those very practical, technical questions of like, what is the infrastructure that we're using? What does it bias towards? Does it bias us towards becoming better, more efficient with how we use resources? Those are questions that we also have to ask.
Definitely. Antonio wants you to continue going off, Rebecca. So I agree entirely. And it's really interesting for me because it's this quote on this slide in some sense, where when we say that everything's up for grabs in terms of the story, then we have to ask, well, do we trust ourselves? Do we have faith that we might be able to tell the best possible story for the widest group of people? And there's this quote from Graeber that really stood out to me when Andy shared it. We may be talking less about a body of theory than about an attitude, or perhaps one might even say a faith. The rejection of certain types of social relationships, the confidence that certain others would be much better ones on which to build a livable society, the belief that such a society could actually exist. And to me, like when you bring up the physical limitations, and also in general, that idea of bridging virtual and physical, it really gets my head spinning. And one of the things that I've noticed in the playful ways treasuries are being managed is that they really start to look kind of like university endowments in some sense. That's the word that I've used now as like my most similar thing. Like what is the Uniswap treasury? Like, we don't know, it's $4 or $5 billion, and it's kind of being used technically to work on DeFi stuff, but they're also funding esports teams. I know that they're working with like major music labels and thinking about how they might be able to do interesting things there. I know that there's other things that are behind the scenes that start to look like, well, okay, they're trying to build something that's very playful. And perhaps there's a portion of that budget that goes towards climate change, that goes towards other physical limitations that otherwise, prior to the existence of all of these tokens, and some in particular that have certain morals associated with them, like what happens when we have these billion-dollar treasuries that can be kind of molded to the stories that they find most morally prescient?
I think one of the really interesting aspects of what both Rebecca and Annalise have shared is that, it's another quote from the same article that Graper wrote really towards the beginning of his kind of academic foray, and which holds a lot of the seeds of what then became, the work on debts and the work on bullshit jobs and various other pieces of the puzzle that he was able to put together. It links to, both this notion of boots on the ground, but also the fact that money fundamentally has to do with the kinds of relationships we have in community, which is really something that I want to hear Annalise explore a little bit more as it relates particularly to ownership and the more potentially playful ways in which we can think about ownership. And when I say that, I also mean quite specifically, like Annalise I think is right, that play requires some kind of rules, but open-ended play, infinite games are one in which play is a negotiation of the rules themselves, right? There's something really recursive about the nature of these infinite games where you're not playing within just the boundaries of the rules, you're playing with the boundaries. And that's something which is really interesting. And ownership has always kind of been one of these boundaries of who is allowed to play, who is allowed into the system, what kind of language do we use, who gets the opportunity to be educated in these specific ways and inculcated into the cult of bankers or into the cult of stonk posters, whichever one. They're similar in their sort of metaphorical makeup, although the kinds of people differ. So, how do we think about money as it relates to the kinds of communities that we form? What kinds of communities are most interesting that you've seen forming in crypto? And does that have anything to do about, with how these communities think about ownership and play with that particular boundary?
Yeah, I think I would want to look at, I mean, what I've been looking at a lot is kind of, DeFi communities, particularly, governance tokens and also social tokens are the other thing, because I think these are two particular instances where people are basically, very explicitly trying to use money to structure social relationships. And ownership is very central to both of these sort of groups of people. And I don't really know if this emphasis on ownership is ultimately going to be a really good thing for the community or not. I mean, I think if you look back a couple years ago, we were talking about sort of permissionlessness and ownerlessness, and kind of that quality of these systems being the really important thing, that no one can take them because no one owns them, and no one can take them down, all of this stuff. But that was really what was being emphasized, and kind of at some point we sort of tilted toward the emphasis on ownership. And I think there was a video that was part of our course material. It was the Andreas Antonoupoulous video, where he sort of talks about Bitcoin being very different from other currencies because of its, the quality of kind of absolute ownership, where you own nothing to anyone else. And this has really, I think, become kind of the dominant view in some ways. But at the same time, I think if you look at, DeFi communities, you look at social tokens communities, people are, forming communities on the basis of ownership, but there's very little attention being paid to kind of the tension between individual ownership, which is really what makes up these communities, and community ownership. And I think if you look at, people want to talk about co-ops and things like that, kind of in comparison to these societies, well, they're quite different. Because it is individual ownership, a group of individual owners that is making up these communities, and these people all have the ability to kind of, do with their tokens what they like, unless there's some sort of vesting schedule or something like that. But it's going to be interesting to see kind of how that tension plays out, and if that becomes a real problem. And I think we've already seen that this is kind of a problem, insofar as some of the projects didn't necessarily set up their incentives in the right way. Like Urine had to sort of re-engineer things when they figured out that they didn't have enough money to pay their contributors, and maybe the community members had gotten too much. And so you have to kind of balance that stuff. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm rambling there, but that's kind of what I've been thinking about.
That leads me, and I know Annalise and I had a great conversation about this, and we brought up kind of like gifts. I can bring up something very practical that happened recently for us. We, of course, GTC did do a token distribution. We had a portion of which is associated with Kernel, which was wonderful in many ways. But the reality is that there's no way to get that perfect. And we knew that from the start. And naturally, there were people who didn't get distributions that were commensurate with the work that they've put into the program. Genuinely speaking, that's just the truth. And what we've tried to describe here is that this was the first in what we hope is a series of imperfect gifts that we can give Kernel is and what it hopes to continue to be. And it's tricky because our main focus is to make sure that we have a space that is about a continuation of relation, that is less about any particular gift that's given at any particular moment, but the sense that we're all indebted, not necessarily to each other, but indebted in general for what we've been given, the opportunities that we've been given, and that we should explore those in an interesting space. And so as it relates to that, one of the things that Graeber wrote about in Debt that really strikes me is the idea of the debt jubilees, and the idea of this space where every once in a while you can kind of look back and be like, okay, yeah, maybe I didn't pay for dinner the last 4 times. Let me buy a gift for my friend. Or maybe I need to make sure that we even out. We mentally get to a space of the point where we're ready to move forward, and we go again, and we continue giving gifts and continue playing those games. And the interesting part for me being that it's actually much better if that's done at an irregular cadence, that it's not pre-planned, that it's not oh, every month there's going to be some type of distribution that's made in this particular fashion, but actually that it's better that it just happens in the natural flow, and that everyone kind of has a good sense of what that is. And you try your best to keep your debts in some order, but at a deeper level, you appreciate the fact that sometimes the debts won't be perfectly managed, and that's the sign of a healthy community. So jubilees matter to me from like an individual who's interested in exploring these token dynamics for this community, but also trying to think about it broader. Like, how does this work in a society that's saddled with large healthcare debts and large education debts that the traditional financial system have left us with? And what is this whole jubilee dynamic that we can play with in the kernel context, low stakes? How can it be used in a much broader way?
It's just a small question for you, Annalise. Yeah, just 2 minutes.
No.
I'm sure you can answer all of our problems.
I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's not something I had really thought about very much. I mean, now that you kind of put it in the context of, maybe kind of contributions to projects and people being rewarded in that way and that sort of stuff, or at least that's kind of how I understood what you were saying, and please correct me if I misunderstood. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, I don't really know what would you just do some sort of airdrop every so often? Like, oh, surprise, I'm not sure how you would really do that. The interesting thing about kind of debt in crypto is that I guess if you're talking about things from that perspective, I think there's kind of a very open source mentality here, though, is that, we're building a bigger thing. It's, I'm indebted to the community because they did a whole bunch of work. They're indebted to me because I did a whole bunch of work. And if you look at a lot of open source projects or projects that use open source libraries and things like that, they will often credit those communities. And so there is that sense of indebtedness. I'm not sure that people expect to be paid for that. I think this is actually maybe a newer sort of thing in crypto where, now that you have DeFi projects and people are just sort of showing up to contribute, and then people are saying, hey, well, maybe we should throw these people some money. Now there is this sort of expectation forming that maybe you should get some sort of compensation, whereas I don't know, previously, maybe that wasn't the case in open source communities. I mean, I don't really know because I don't necessarily study open source sort of more generally. But, I think if you're thinking about debt kind of in other contexts in crypto, if you're thinking about it just sort of basically like, well, where am I going to get in debt in crypto? It's like if I take out a loan on MakerDAO or something like that, it's interesting to think about the social relationship that is. Like, is it different? There's a weird sort of difference, I think, morally and things like that. If I'm in debt to a protocol as opposed to a person, and you have to wonder, is like, okay, well, is that better? Is that worse? How do we think about debt in that context when on the other side of that relationship, it's no longer really a person? Or maybe we think, well, actually, there are a lot of persons. It's the people who are, maybe the holders of Maker. Maybe you're actually really indebted to them at the end of the day. I don't know. Those are the sort of things that are kind of popping into my mind.
I love it.
Yeah, I also want to just comment a little bit further on that because it speaks to something that Rebecca had brought up earlier on in the talk, is that, one of the points that Graeber makes again and again throughout the entire body of his work, not just in debt, although he makes it in the clearest way in that book, is that the sort of debt which has to be repaid only ever crops up in situations of large inequality or structural coercion. So debt between friends is easily forgivable, and debt between the governments and big corporates is easily forgivable, as 2008 proved. What is not forgivable is debt between people who, like small individuals and the big banks. So anything that exists in situations of large scale inequality or structural coercion is the kinds of debt which has this morality inevitably pinned onto it. And in that sense, like that's really the context in which he brings up this concept of a jubilee, when you have such radical situations of large scale inequality and coercion that you need a complete reset. Now, it's debatable, and I think endlessly so, as to whether we need one at this stage in our society. But what we can usefully think about based on Graeber's observations is how can we avoid creating those kinds of structural coercion and large inequality in the systems that we build for ourselves when we're embodying this practice of being already free. It's absolutely critical that instead of getting into the kinds of situation where the only next move in the game is total factory resets, instead we use the programmable nature of the flow of value which we're developing to ensure that these kinds of inevitable inequalities which crop up when humans transact with each other are consistently balanced, right? Like, we're looking for a sustainable kind of global joy through aggregating all of these individual joyful acts of subversion, which we talked about in the first module. And the way in which we do that, if you go one slide back toward the Perry Mehrling stuff where he talks about the pyramid of money, is by thinking very, very carefully about what this pyramid is actually teaching us, right? Here, Mehrling makes this wonderful point that there are many different kinds of money. In the current financial system, what you have, the best kind of money, are Federal Reserve notes. Beneath that, you have actual currency. Then you have deposits at bank. And finally, you have credits. Now, in boom cycles, the pyramid, as Holly Grimm's gifts so beautifully displays here, in boom cycles, the pyramid expands and all of these kinds of money begin to kind of look more and more like each other. Your credit looks mostly like a deposit at a bank, looks mostly like currency, looks mostly like a Fed note, right? And the base of the pyramid expands, and you get this kind of situation in which the monetarists look right, and the key principle from a fiduciary perspective is discipline. But then in bust cycles, when the difference between these kinds of money is reestablished, and often in very, very stark, difficult to handle ways, which cause suffering for the people at the bottom end of these structurally coercive and unequal situations, is, the Keynesians look right, and the principle which we most need in those times is elasticity, right? At the moment, this constantly fluctuating money pyramid, which fluctuates at every level, both on a business day, throughout the week, throughout the seasons, throughout many multi-year cycles, is managed by a group of unelected bureaucrats at the Fed. And the promise of programmable flows of value is precisely that we can replace the kinds of money here, in particular the best kind of money, with, instead of having it be Federal Reserve notes, have it be a peer-to-peer currency, which has some kind of different morality encoded into it about what it means to relate to other human beings. And in that context, you might not need like a full-on jubilee. You might just need this, really beautiful notion that Rebecca brings up of boots on the ground, because what Graeber was really saying is that, like, one obvious role for radical intellectuals is to do precisely this, to look at those who are already creating viable alternatives, those who are living in situations where they have to come up with community currencies or alternative means of describing value because the state has been an abysmal failure. And Graeber studied these kinds of communities in Madagascar, right? And look at them, see, and try to figure out what the larger implications of what they are already doing, and then offer those ideas back, not as prescriptions, but as contributions, possibilities, or as gifts, right? And he, in particular, says that such a project would have to have two aspects: one ethnographic, i.e. studying people as they are, and one utopian, suspended in this constant dialogue. So Rebecca, I know that your work focused quite a large degree on the impacts that community inclusion currencies would have on women in particular, and that's, it wasn't necessarily as hopeful as we might like to think at first. But what do you think of these utopian ideals? Do you have a sense of what it might mean to begin to think about how we could program these pyramids differently, play different games with one another?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I could also just share very briefly. So in the study, we airdropped, it was equivalent to about $30 to 400 people. And this was kind of like as an emergency cash transfer used in response to the pandemic. And although we did see very positive results on things like food expenditure, which went way up, wallet balance, average trade size, frequency of trade, there was a very big difference in that outcome between women and men. So while they were still positive for women, they were considerably lower. I guess this kind of speaks to what you're saying, which is like, you have this tool and it has been shown to be effective in some ways in terms of giving people an alternative medium, in terms of giving people universal basic income. And you have to do this in the context of the existing disparities that are there, right? And I think we often speak about them very broadly, just in terms of access to financial markets, but you can really break that down, right? I mean, gender is one of those biggest disparities that exists across the board. And then in the context of COVID, where women have been hit the hardest, that's also something that you have to take into account. And I think this is why, at least I appreciate so much the kind of work that organizations like Grassroots Economics do, is because they take these very same tools that we often use or speak about in a very sort of utopian context. So Vivek mentioned earlier, like bridging sort of the virtual and the physical. And I think when you do that in the physical, in the sense of different kinds of communities, so not necessarily online or Web 3.0 communities, that's when you start hitting into those very physical, tangible challenges, right? Like things like the employment that people have available to them, or women's ability to create income generating opportunities in the first place, regardless of whatever medium they're using as currency.
Yeah, that's really, really insightful. And, you know, long may that particular kind of work go on, because it's really, really necessary to reimagining what it means to play with the flow of value in society in such a way that we can ensure that the kinds of structural cohesion that currently exist are perhaps, you know, reset, which it brings, you know, Vivek, it brings us back to faith, in the sense that, you know, these things have always had to do, like, the opposite of the Jubilee, and not the opposite, but like the thing which fulfilled the function of ensuring that we didn't necessarily have to have Jubilees, was reckoning, right? Like communal reckonings, the sense that we would all sit together once a year or every half year, and, you know, it would be, well, Vivek owes Andy 5 dinners because he's constantly hungry, and Andy owes Annalise 3 you know, cows, because they actually got together in Africa once, and he sort of stole a few, as he's prone to do because he has a particular thing for cattle. And everybody would sort of describe their debts to one another. We would sort of say that, well, 3 dinners equals 1 cow, and cancel as much as we could. And then there'd be a token payment, literally, and it's an interesting use of the word, a token payment from me to Annalise, and everybody's debts would go back to being 0, and then we would begin again. And in this way, you know, we can see how the language of faith and finance has always been fundamentally one and the same thing, whether it's the bond, which is religare, the word for religion is bond, right? It's a bond of one to reality. We are constantly indebted, not just to one another, but to, as you say, life, for the gift that we've been given in terms of what we get to live. We are, you know, constantly seeking redemption. There is so many different words that we can explore that really highlights this kind of way of looking. And, you know, just to kind of bring it back with Annalise, I'm really, really fascinated where your research has landed, and what you're going to say. If you can give us, you know, for the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes, a brief TLDR of both the hope, perhaps, but also some of the contradictions that you've come across in these morally inclined crypto communities of which you've been a part.
Yeah. And before Annalise gives us some alpha via her research paper, I think it might be good to do it maybe 3-ish minutes so that we have time for at least 1 or 2 questions. There's been such an awesome chat. I think everyone wants both of your research projects, Rebecca and Annalise. So we'll save the chat and try to do that. But please, Annalise, and then we'll take a couple questions to round out.
Yeah, the truth is that I basically have no idea what I'm going to write about yet. The thing with anthropology is that you basically go into the field, you study all these people, and then you sort of figure out what you have when you get back. I have some ideas. Like I said, I've become pretty interested in people's ideas about ownership in the industry, and kind of why that's so important to people, and the connection between kind of the macroeconomic landscape there, and what that means kind of, I guess, in the context of a larger sort of generational shift potentially. But, you know, in terms of other things that I'll probably write about, you know, anonymity, you know, kind of the way that communities are formed, the way communities are governed. I'm very interested in this tension between individual ownership and community ownership, and how sort of people seem to think that individual ownership can be equated with community ownership, that sort of stuff. So I'll have to let you know when I finish it in a year or 2, but those are some, you know, preliminary ideas.
Yeah. Amazing, amazing. I really am grateful that Tegan just asked this question. This is something that also inspired by Graper's work, we have a whole piece around conversation, which maybe we can link in the chat for somebody who wants to go really deep. But there is a question here about from Tegan. If you want to ask it yourself, maybe you could do so.
Yes, I will try. So what is the role of women in society? And I know, Rebecca, you talked a lot about kind of the disparities between women and men in your control trials. And it got me thinking a lot about how the difference of giving $1 to a man and the difference of giving $1 to a woman, just kind of in a more general sense, how women may be more likely to buy things like in regards to health and education for children. So not only what is the role of women now, but how can shifting that also increase the efficiency of open web communities?
Yeah, I guess I can speak to that a little bit. I love this question, first of all, and it's one that I ask every day in my work in a space that has huge gender gap, both in terms of users or investors or people participating in these tools, as well as the people building them. And I want to say, I mean, first of all, just with the grassroots economics, you do see a difference in the kinds of things that people buy. So for example, women tend to be the members of things like savings groups or the chamas as they're locally known. But it's also really, it's very empowering to also hear stories when women will say, yes, you know, in using this community currency, I'm now able to save more and grow my business, or I'm now saving more than my husband, right? And so your question, well, how does having this tool then change gender dynamics, or just dynamics in general within the household or at the community level? And I like that you're asking this question because it's easy to answer if I'm, say, studying the grassroots economics community currency network. But I haven't heard it asked for, you know, the way people use DeFi products. I haven't really heard it asked for governance. And I think that this maybe speaks to just the lack of the question in the first place. Maybe it's a data problem of us just not knowing, and there are several organizations, you know, I think of like SheFi, I think of the Komorebi Fund that just came out as well, and all these really exciting things that are women-led. And I know that someone else recently just did a survey on how women in crypto view, you know, receiving income in crypto or investing in crypto and stuff. So there are certainly baby steps out there, but I think my response to your question is like, we actually just don't ask that question nearly enough. So it's a very difficult one to answer outside of just the personal, individual, subjective context.
I would just add very quickly that, you know, we sort of know from broader studies of the economy, or a lot of people would argue, and this is something that David was particularly interested in, was kind of literature about care and sort of kind of women's labor in the economy that goes unrecognized, but is sort of crucial to the functioning of capitalist systems and things like that. And I think it's, you know, important, hopefully in crypto. I mean, it's the gender stuff in crypto is very difficult to study because there's so much pseudo-anonymity, and people aren't really very forthcoming about this. But I think, you know, if we want to kind of recreate economic systems or rebuild alternative economic systems, we're going to have to kind of consider women's economic role and kind of the sorts of systems that they need and kind of what works for them. And we can't sort of exclude them from building this stuff. And if we do that, then we're not really going to get very far, I think.
Awesome. Anna shared a link in the chat to the study that Rebecca referenced, which is, I think, the most comprehensive. Agree. I think there may be space for much deeper conversation here. And thank you for asking the question, Tegan. Anyone else who wants to unmute and ask? Probably have time for max 2 more, but maybe 1. There's a lot of room in the chat, so I'm trying to find something here. Oh, I do have one that if we fall back, I think I'm going to go with. This is a very radical left turn, but one that I hope Rebecca and Annalise are willing to answer, maybe Andy too. There is a question from RV in the chat that I think was my favorite question. Where is it? And Antonio's answer was the funny one. I'll read Antonio's answer first. Where is it? What are some examples of play for you in your life? And I'll start with Antonio's answer, who's not here anymore. He's amazing. He's an amazing dancer. I think he's right now prepping 8 hours a day for a show he has in Switzerland in a month while he's doing his Kernel Block and exploring DAOs for artists and creatives. Antonio says dancing, clubbing, watching a full marathon of Law and Order SVU. So that is Antonio. I saw some other great ones in the chat as I buy some time for Rebecca and Annalise. Andy, of course, loves playing with cattle, so there's that. But hopefully we can come up with some better answers.
Well, for me, I really love dancing, and I see dancing as play, and one of the best kinds of play, because there's something about physical movement that just puts you in a different mental state. I think I also like play. I love movies, I love film. I really like the Kazakh film industry. Kazakh cinema in general is my jam. So if you're interested in that, like, would love to chat about it. Yeah, and cooking. Cooking is very playful too.
Cool. We'll see how many people join the Kazakh film Slack channel that we create after this. Amazing. Annalise?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I guess, you know, I love animals, so I play with my dog all the time. Love playing with animals sort of generally, that sort of stuff. Yeah, maybe I just don't have enough play in my life at the moment. Maybe I've been a bit too serious.
Well, I don't know. For me, one thing is that this conversation genuinely feels like play to me. And I feel very grateful to have people who are willing to have conversations like this. I think that it's a great joy to have them, and grateful that we've had space for it here. And yeah, in general, creating spaces for conversation, having groups of people together and exploring ideas in spaces where the conversations can continue, where it's not so transactional. I'm very happy, as an example, to be here with you guys virtually, as opposed to being in, let's say, Miami physically, because it makes a big difference that I know that I'll talk to both of you again sometime soon. And even if we're on a Zoom call right now, we'll hopefully get to meet in person at some point and continue the conversation. So that's me. Andy, anything other than cattle that you're into? Just curious.
Anarchy.
Perfect.
Cattle and anarchy.
Cattle and anarchy. All right. Now you know what to expect if you ever visit Andy in South Africa. It's a very dangerous game. And I promise you, you will see cattle and it will be anarchic, if that's the word. But yeah, I will finish with this quote on anarchism, since we're here. Anarchism is primarily concerned with forms of practice. It insists before anything else that one must oneself in one's relations with one's friends and allies embody the society one wishes to create. That's from Graeber, great man, great influence on the syllabus. Rebecca, Annalise, thank you again so much for being here. Hope to do more of these in the future. And thanks to everyone who joined in. Amazing combo in the chat as always. We'll keep going from here. All right, we're gonna do the bye train again. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See you guys.
Peace.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, home. Bye.
Bye-bye. This is my favorite part of the conversation, by the way. It's just people. And oh, I think it's cutting out for me. And the people who stick around, I'm like always like, who's gonna stay till the end?
Who doesn't have to go to another meeting right now?
Yes, that's the
Actually,
key.
it's pretty smart that it's an hour and a half, because most meetings start on the hour. So it's got some time to play around.
We did play with that. That is definitely something we do. Yeah. That's also why I do 20-minute meeting slots usually, because then it always keeps people on their toes. They're like, oh, you want to meet at 2:20 p.m.? Okay. So there's always like some time to spare before or after? What's the chat thing? I have to be testing an alpha package right now. LOL. RV, thank you for your question on play. It made a big impact, obviously. And Tegan and Rebecca, I know I wanted you guys to link. Tegan was hosting a clubhouse on, was it African? It was a specific African NFT artist last Friday, right?
It was, the topic was revolutionizing Africa with NFTs. Yes.
Okay. And there was somebody who joined, right?
I wish I had seen that. I just don't have an iPhone. So talking about exclusivity in DeFi.
Well, they have just made an update where Androids can join now too. And I have lots of invites.
Okay.
So
I'll be at the next one.
Yeah, that'd be great. I look forward to reading your paper. I was just like saying like, wow, like that's my goal, like to write something like that is definitely a goal. So I really appreciate having it now.
Yeah, and I really appreciate grassroots economics, allowing an undergrad to do that. And I think that kind of embodies sort of just the attitude and principle that people generally have in Web 3.0 communities. Is like a lot of the barriers that would traditionally exist in access, whether it's for research or financial opportunities, just aren't there because we are all playing in this giant social experiment.
One of the books that kind of got me interested in international development is called Poor Economics. I mean, it's a cool book, but at the beginning, they talk about how like, you know, we don't have any answers. We're just like showing you what we learned from trying things out a little bit. And I think that as you like ask these big questions, that's a lot more of like the results you expect. Like, you know, I got a little piece of the answer and someone else should come and build upon this. So I think that's kind of, I mean, I haven't read the paper, but I think that that's kind of a lot of the value I see in it.
Mm-hmm. Currently working on a very short article form of it, so you don't have to read 50 pages.
That's great. Yeah, I look forward to reading that as well.
Hey, Annalise, could you talk a little bit more? One of the things I just adore, I mean, everything that David ever did, and we've chatted some about it, but you know, after debt came bullshit jobs, as you say. He spoke a lot about care, right? And even in the quote that Vivek picked for this talk about like these new econo-linguistic languages, networks are not about money and not about language. They're about new ways of ordering both that allow us to program the flow of value in any way we care to imagine. Like for me, like this notion of care, and in particular, what it says about the role of women and what it says about equitable societies and new kinds of relationships in community is really interesting. And I wonder, like, yeah, what you think about like care as an industry, and then care as it relates to, in particular, the role of women in these kind of networks. It's such an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And it's something that anthropologists are just sort of starting to get interested in the last couple of years. And David started a reading group about care shortly before I left for fieldwork. So we did that a bit. But you know, I guess one of the points that he makes in Debt is that, you know, social relations aren't just all about exchange, or they're not all about reciprocity. You know, they're also about care is one of the things. And he talks a little bit in Debt and kind of elsewhere about this, you know, sort of like relationship between mother and child, for example. It's a very selfless relationship on the part of the mother because it's not reciprocal in any way. But it's one of the most basic kind of relationships that we need in society. You know, she's not really getting anything out of the relationship, arguably. It's actually kind of incredibly extractive, but mothers do this sort of thing and they offer care. And he's also talked about in the past, I think he says in Bullshit Jobs, you know, basically the people who are kind of doing caring labor in society are basically the worst paid, with the exception of doctors. But, you know, care workers, teachers, all of these people that really make society work and run are really very poorly paid and not valued. You know, white collar workers, management consultants make way more money than the people who are taking care of your grandparents do. But this is like nonsensical. And so what if we kind of, you know, flip things on its head and created a society where care was kind of at the core of things. It was that sort of relationship that, was foundational. Yeah, if anybody's interested, there's definitely some literature, like I said, that's kind of coming out on this, and I can point you in the direction of kind of what that is if people wanted to read about it. But yeah, it's interesting to think about it in the context of crypto, I think in some ways, there's an element of care because people are very concerned about future and kind of caring for the future and kind of preserving the potential of the future and things like that. They're worried about inflation. They're worried about kind of, currencies being debased and things like that. And what they're really worried about is not really, being able to maintain their livelihood and not being able to have sort of a future full of potential and full of opportunities and full of, liveliness, I guess, to some extent. So I think we can think about it a little bit in that context as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. Please, if you would deign to drop some of those links somewhere in the kernel Slack, it would be greatly appreciated. Some really, really interesting thought there.
Yeah. Kernel General has been blowing up with links, which is good. That's always a good sign. Mohammed has a question, please.
Amazing conversation this morning, particularly for the two, Annalise and Rebecca. I was wondering, we tend to not hear a lot about Austrian economics. I'm just kind of wondering why. I mean, that's my background is economic science, and I wonder, I never got any Austrian economics on my coursework, period. Hayek was really my intro. And once I read some of his work on the denationalization of currency, I realized that denationalization became our decentralization. But overall, I just don't hear Austrian economics at all. And I understand because I'm in the US, but do you guys speak more about it on your side of the pond? I'm just wondering.
I guess, for me, I don't have a background in, traditional economics or anything like that. And anthropologists really aren't that keen on economists sort of generally, but especially probably Austrian economics people. It's just sort of, yeah, it's just not, they're not really that, it's just very different, I guess, from the way that we think about the economy and the way that we think about money. It's not, it's sort of ideologically, I guess, it's kind of in conflict with anthropology in some ways. So we don't really talk about it very much. Or I guess, I mean, we talk about it insofar as, people that we study talk about it. We don't use it as the sort of foundation for the theories that we use to analyze people's behavior.
I also wanted to add, that's a super interesting question because, like, yes, I mentioned Hayek, denationalization of money, competing currencies, and then everything just around like subjectivity of value, which is something that comes a lot. I could be very, very wrong, but I think part of it just stems from what we were talking about around the language and the jargon and the terms that we use and the ideas that crypto people are willing to associate themselves with or not associate themselves with. I think that this is a space where we want everything to feel new, right? And even something like community currencies, right? Community currencies, what are they? They're just money. Like, people have been using money for thousands of years. The earliest formal community currencies cropped up, well before 1940 even. So it's like, yes, we're using these new tools, but a lot of these things have existed in some form, and so have the ideas, right? Whether it's around decentralization or tokenized governance, or even just the idea that you can have a world of competing currencies, right? That is a possibility. I think Austrian economics, there's a lot of breeding ground of some of the ideas that we talk about in DeFi. But this also, for me at least, often feels like a very fast-paced kind of space where, the people doing the most work aren't necessarily the ones doing dissertations on Austrian economics that's linked to DeFi, or even doing research at all, right? It's usually your developers and your cool apps that are cropping up. And this is why I always emphasize a lot of the work that needs to be done is kind of the more slow thinking work. Kind of going on a tangent here, but I think that's partially why, you know, as you said, it's not something that comes up a lot.
Yeah, that's the hope with spaces like this, that we can, at least in some conversational sense, bridge the gaps a little bit. Yeah. Just as a side note, go ahead, Andy, go ahead.
It's also that, like, Rebecca's point is quite a profound one, and I'm not sure that it's something that will change even if we call for slower thinking, right? Like, in the sense that Austrian economics was very widely discussed in the early Bitcoin community, not just Hayek, but von Mises and many others. And it informed a lot about the initial defense of the 21 million cap, deflationary currency. Much of the care for the future that Annalise mentioned, all of this stuff was caught up in arguments drawn almost directly from von Mises and Hayek were the two most often quoted, but there were various other kind of fringe ones that exist on the Bitcoin Talk forum if you want to go and look for them. But what Rebecca is saying, I think, is really, really on point, in the sense that all of a sudden, because we now have these environments with rich scripting languages in which you can implement economic ideas in executable language, people aren't taking the time to write a protocol thesis anymore. They're just deploying the code, right? And that code is ultimately not just theory, but practice. And if it's successful or not is its own proof. You know, like, I think that one of the things that I was sort of saying at the end of the Andreas Antonopoulos brief is, it says, yeah, Andreas is talking about these unassailable facts that do not rely on any control architecture. They are true by virtue of the language in which they're expressed, not because anyone in a position of authority said so. So my economic theory is not true because I'm a professor at a university that says this is the case and I have a resume and 40 published papers and whatever. My economic theory is correct because it has 1 billion TVL, and there's a whole bunch of apes who have jumped into the protocol, right? And so it's like a fundamentally different, well, not fundamentally, I use that word way too much, but it's a different way of thinking about economic hypothesis and proof, because, like, the environment, the medium in which economic thinking is happening is different. And it's like this this sort of irreversible mix of economics and language, which is, you know, Solidity or Viper or any of these feature complete scripting languages. So, like, the next Hayek and von Mises probably exists, but they're not writing natural language, they're writing code.
But I also felt that Hayek's writing was more from a design and social perspective. And I think that those boundaries that we're breaking down are more so Keynesian thoughts from Keynesian economists. I just kind of feel sometimes that understanding that there is a need probably for state money, and then there's probably a need for private money or public money is something that even as a society, I think is kind of hard to explain when we've been raised in a world that only has one money. So everyone's still, this whole Bitcoin maximus, I feel like came out of that same idea. Well, there's a new money, well, then that must be the only one. So it's like now you're moving from one centralized perspective to the next. But I think a lot of it has to do with the idea that we still don't understand that there is a need for multiple monies depending on where you live, what you want, and, you know, what you perceive yourself to be doing in the future really would determine more so what money you use. But this idea that there should only be one, I feel like it even hurts us on the cryptocurrency side, because now we're looking for the final one here on this side. And this oneness, I think, works within the social construct of who we are as human beings, but it doesn't necessarily work when it comes to commerce, I guess you would say.
Yeah, you know, I would actually push back on that. And I share that view for the longest time of like, you know, the reason why this tension exists, why we haven't reached mass adoption is because it's like this philosophical mind boggle that most people haven't gotten over. And I would actually say that my work in Kenya somewhat changed that, because this is an example where, again, you're using the same tools and you're just wrapping it in a very different way, right? So it's like, yes, people are trading on the X-DAI blockchain and they're using their USSD codes. And this is very contextual, but, you know, in a place like Kenya where people have been using things like M-Pesa for the longest time, the idea or the feel of using a different form of money isn't actually all that new, right? So like just tangibly, the idea of like, I am now trading on my phone and I'm sending these tokens to people and they're sending it back to me. And maybe I'm even getting negatively taxed on things. And maybe there's all these complex design parameters. At the end of the day, I'm just using this currency, you know, to buy my food and pay for my child's school fees or pay for my church tithes. So it isn't all that different. And I think it's also just useful to remember that money has looked very different around the world, and usually in places like Venezuela or South Africa or Kenya or Zimbabwe or Uruguay or whatever, where you see all these interesting creative examples of how people have managed multi-currency systems. Those currencies might not have been Bitcoin, they might have been just, you know, direct bartering of goods. And could have been things like tires, right? So all the early, need some water. All the early community currency projects had strange things that people were using as money, but they did what they had to do, right? So whether it was post-World War I or during the recession in the US, that's why, you know, studying history is so important. But again, it's like when you're working in an industry where protocols are getting millions of dollars of TVL in a matter of days, it often feels like there isn't a lot of time to even study history.
I've been thinking, Rebecca, I've been thinking a lot about the, I like all the comments and the thoughts on play, because like, I think I'm kind of like Annalise, like I take myself way too seriously. And it's interesting because it's me compensating for a time when I was very silly and people wouldn't take me seriously. So now I'm kind of like, well, like, oh, I need to like, you know, button my shirt up all the way so that people actually pay attention to me. But what I'm really starting to grasp is the power of like these digital assets for the younger generations. They don't care about Great British pounds or dollars. They care about Fortnite bucks. So when they start coming into crypto and it's a number on their screen, like they're not going to care. And that's why I've gotten really excited now about kind of gaming and play and NFTs as the on-ramp for people to this. But I think there's some interesting points to pick apart. Like most people don't care what's going on behind the scenes, right? Like I push a number, I push you, I push send, it goes down on my screen, it goes up on your screen like Bob's your uncle. But the difference here, the key difference is that we have the option of digging in and verifying for ourselves that everything is working as it should be and everything's in order. And that's kind of tying back a little bit to what some people were saying a little earlier about the Austrian economics and this kind of like tension of just building and, you know, not necessarily thinking through a lot. I think the fact that we can now pull these protocols into the light and verify for ourselves means that we don't have to hide. I kind of mentioned this in the chat a little earlier. We don't have to hide behind these fancy headquarters in the city with the columns in the front and the fancy shoes and the fancy suits, because we can put a dog with sunglasses on our website because anybody can look past this and check that like this is very serious and this is for real and this is very well researched. But I think just a last bit, which I was talking with Andy a bit earlier about, is this balance between like, we have to have a very deep reverence for what we're doing and a very strong sense of responsibility, because what I really do believe we're doing is we're trying to build the systems that will support human flourishing for centuries to come. But then at the same time, we can get into the situation where we have this like over-analysis paralysis of just like, everything must be perfect. And like, we need to consider every single thing, because if our protocol gets hacked, then like everything is ruined. And I think I'm trying to push myself to hold this very like a bit more lightly and saying, well, let's think it through. Let's be careful, but we also have to have a bit of a bias towards action because there is a sense of urgency, because we're setting up the world now so that people in the future don't have an equal opportunity to enjoy the beauty of the world. And I think that's something that's kind of motivating me, is that sense that, you know, that people in the future have an equal right to prosperity as people in the present, just like people who are far away from me are equal to the people who are near me, right? But yeah, I think that is an interesting tension, the like having this sort of somber like sense of gravitas that what we do on the blockchain is forever, but then at the same time, like, let's just have a bit of fun and try it out. We're all kind of breaking new ground here.
I kind of wanted,
I can't add anything.
I kind of wanted to say something about like play. I feel as we're talking about it, we're kind of downplaying like exactly what play is, because essentially everything that we do is based on play. Everything about our society is based on play. Like when you have kids, they learn about societal rules or how they should act, how they should behave through play. Like if this kid diverts from whatever they is like considered the norm, then no other kid will play with that kid. And it's the same for other animals as well. So when I see like us talking about playing crypto, I think that's just us establishing kind of what is the culture for crypto and how can other people engage with that in a way where they won't be turned around.
Yeah. One of the thoughts in the syllabus is like, at the end, there's one last module that we do, which is kind of like the bonus pack, which is called the gift. And one of the things, Rachel, that comes to mind is just like expanding, one thing that's described is expanding the group of people who can play. You know, the big problem with playing games is the kid on the side who is not allowed to play and is feeling some type of way because he or she is not involved. And in crypto circles, you have this permissionlessness, which is really nice, not just on a technical sense, but in terms of like joining communities. But there are big cultural barriers that still have to be overcome so that somebody feels comfortable playing, right? And if you don't like playing basketball, that you can dance or that you can do whatever you want to do, and that finds some meaningful money, let's say, behind it in this new context.
And I think another thing that I'd want to add there is like, something I try to do myself, because I think, especially as a woman, sometimes doesn't feel like there is a lot of space to play. That's in crypto and pretty much everywhere. And so thinking about, you know, not only how do we make these tools more inclusive, but also how do we expand the environment for playing for everyone, right? I think of like the whole attitude of like, I test in pride and stuff like that. And it's like, there's a lot of play that you see in protocols and the way that they communicate themselves and the memes and the narrative, right? Like Zappa just came out with their whole learn section that is like gamified and has a narrative. And like, that's so cool, that's play. And it's being combined with these awesome tools and financial products that we have. But also I think about like who gets to play, who has the freedom to play, and what are the ways that we can support more people doing that?
Yeah, definitely. Rebecca, I think you're gonna like this. This is some alpha. There's a website that's dropping soon, and it's called Gitcoin.dance, and that's all I'll reveal for now. There's some
interesting dance, like
dance, exactly.
Okay,
exactly. I'm not gonna say anything else. I don't want to cause any ruckus in the markets, but the website is launching soon, and it should be quite interesting. And I genuinely agree. Speaking, because we're talking about dance so much, I just want to bring it up. Antonio, after he's done with his performance in Switzerland. So if anyone's in Switzerland, he said he has tickets for anyone who wants to come. He's gonna lead a junto dance class, and he's like a professional dancer, like 8 hours a day. All he does is dance, and then somehow he still comes and asks amazing questions in firesides. So that's a Junto to come. And my hope is that that's why I've been so happy about the Junto infrastructure for this kernel block. It's like people are just like doing the things that they want to do. And the hope is that, you know, there's an environment that's very much neutral, that is a diverse space with lots of different interests, and that we can explore those interests together in a way that then informs the way we think about these new forms of money.
And I just wanted to say something briefly about what Rachel had brought, her point about play. I have a couple of friends who are in medicine, and I remember them forwarding me a link that showed an unborn child, probably around the 3rd trimester or the 2nd trimester, actually playing in the womb. So understanding how quickly we learn to play, and perhaps that maybe our first learning avenue may be actually play itself, I think shows how deeply ingrained play is in the human being. But also, just to kind of build off of that, there is a mixed martial arts that I practice pretty often called capoeira. And it comes from South America. And play was actually hidden. The martial art is hidden inside of play and dance intentionally, so that the Spanish would not know what they were practicing. And this particular martial art had a lot to do with the Africans in South America getting their freedom from Spain, because the first freed states in South America were led by these capoeira artists, who were known to be extremely resourceful in this quote unquote play dance that was actually very, very deadly. They were known to be able to take on maybe about 12 to 16 Spanish soldiers per capoeira martial artists. So they're very, very deadly, but the idea is they were practicing all the time. And the whole time the Spanish thought that they were playing. And they were playing. So it's interesting to know how, you know, play can be so quickly translated into something useful. In addition to the same thing with the game Monopoly, which was created by a woman, but originally the game was to teach people why being a monopolist was wrong. But the game became popular because of the exact opposite. So now we play the game hoping to win the game, but in actuality, she created the game, because at that time, I think the oil barons and the railroads were like, you know, the Wall Street of the time. So it's just interesting how games can turn against us, they can come for us, but ultimately it may be the first thing we learn, even in the womb, is how to play.
That's awesome. I want to practice some capoeira with you. I had a crazy experience when I was like 17. One of my friends, Lucas O'Connor, was really getting into capoeira and almost kicked my face off. I was like, Lucas, like, this is supposed to be for fun. You need to stop moving so fast.
It's the rhythm. It can be dangerous, but the rhythm allows you to not get hit, hopefully, you know.
Exactly. Exactly.
One time or another, it kind of comes with the territory of playing.
It's true. It's a game. It's a game. Yeah. Also, yeah, just so you guys know, Rebecca at one point was thinking about leaving her wonderful job in decentralized finance to go work in traditional finance. I'm never going to let her forget that she considered it. She literally was like, oh, let me go work at like some big institution and like go do that thing. I don't understand. But anyways, she came to her senses. At that time, she was going to be in Atlanta, which is where Tegan and Mohammed are. They were, I was going to introduce y'all and like hang out, be friends. Capoeira,
there's still a potential trip on the way, and it sounds like maybe there's even more reasons to do that. Yeah, so we should talk. But Vivek, the number of people who are not letting me live that down. I mean, when I told people, oh yeah, no, I actually declined the offer, it would have been with BlackRock as an analyst. Like, it's as traditional as it gets. So many people, I mean, professors, colleagues, you know, like, oh, thank God, what were you thinking?
It's perfect. It's perfect. Yeah. It's a win for us all. That's why I'm so happy about it. I'm like, holy smoke. Dodge bullet there. Cool. Okay. I know we're really coming up on the end of our happy hour here now. So thank you everyone for sticking around. Looks like Andy is preparing for some wonderful dinner over there. And there's Anna, who was in a different screen a minute ago. So here we are in real life. Enjoy your dinner, enjoy your days. I hope everyone has a wonderful time with the rest of your Thursdays. Thank you for being here. See you guys soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.